Hello, everybody. A very good morning to all distinguished speakers and to our audience on YouTube. Welcome to the webinar on ethical leadership of ASEAN and in ASEAN with the theme Developing Responsible Leaders on the World Stage. The webinar is co-hosted by the ASEAN Human Development Organization, the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, and the ASEAN University Network Secretariat. These three organizations are the co-founders of the Ethics Council and Advisory for the ASEAN Region, or ECAR in short. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to inform that the opinions expressed in a webinar are those of the authors only and may not necessarily represent the views of the organizing agencies or of any other ASEAN institutions or bodies. Onto the agenda of the webinar. The aim of this webinar is to illuminate how to become an ethical leader, what that entails, and how ethical leaders in ASEAN are shaping their organizations towards the purpose of responsibility for good. To ignite the ideas on how to answer these questions and to open the floor for further discussion, we feel honored to begin the session with a keynote speech by the Nobel Peace Prize Laureate and the former president of Timor-Leste, His Excellency Ramos-Horta. For the main session, we are delighted to be joined by 5 distinguished speakers. First, we have Mr. Gil Gonzalez, the Executive Director of ASEAN Business Advisory Council, followed by Dr. Marzuki Darusman, the Chair of an independent international fact-finding mission on Myanmar under the UN Human Rights Council. Next, we have Dr. Mee Eng, the Executive Director of the ASEAN Foundation. Then we'll be joined by Ms. Raudhah Nazran. She is the founder and CEO of the Accelerate Global, a social enterprise aimed at tackling youth and employment issues worldwide and the leadership for Gen Z and women in ASEAN. Last but not least, representing young generation, we have with us Mr. Jamesun Bejarin. He is the president of Student Council at Ateneo de Manila University, the Philippines. I'm also glad to introduce the moderator of the webinar, Dr. Bob Audrey. Dr. Bob is the associate and the strategic advisor to the ASEAN Human Development Organization. He is also the founder of the Ethics Council and Advisory for the ASEAN region. Before we begin the webinar, I have the honor to invite the AUN Executive Director, Dr. Cholatit Tiratiti, to introduce the establishment of the Ethics Council and Advisory for the ASEAN region. Dr. Cholatit, please.
Thank you very much, Naparat. Excellency, distinguished speakers, and distinguished moderator, Bob, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me briefly to introduce the ECAR, the Ethics Council and Advisory for the ASEAN region. The purpose of ECAR is to identify and discuss ethical issues in our region. As a council, we provide a space for dialogue among the stakeholders on such issues. As an advisory body, ECAR generates recommendations based on expert views, fact-finding missions, and science. And to be a think tank for research and anticipatory capability on emerging ethical issues of interest, ECAR is also provide the research consultancy to the ASEAN Secretariat and interested parties. ECAR has been established by 3 founding organizations. One is the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, or FIHRRST. Secondly is the ASEAN Human Development Organization, or AHDO, AHDO. And thirdly is the ASEAN University Network Secretariat. Together, 3 organizations founded ECAR. Our previous works included 2 webinars on practical ethics in a diverse ASEAN, also the rise of corporate ethics in ASEAN. And together with this current one today, we have been gathering audience to our webinars over 1,500 people already. Thank you very much. That is a very brief introduction to ICA. Back to you, Naparat.
Thank you, Dr. Charlotte. Dr. Bob, Dr. Marzuki, would you like to say a few words about the establishment of IGAR, or shall we proceed to the next session? Dr. Bob, please.
Just to say how honored I am that we have led from what began as a rather informal discussion about the importance of ethics in ASEAN to this stage now where we've received a lot of encouragement in taking a step forward. And this webinar is a good example of that step forward.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Dr. Marzuki, would you like to say a few words?
Naparat, for my part, I think I'll join both my colleagues in welcoming all of us, especially Dr. Ramos-Horta, Jose. Much appreciated for your appearance and participation, and looking forward to a productive discussion. And this, of course, is not the end of the story. We've sort of perceived these activities as the beginning of a long conversation on ethics in the region. So hang in there, and let's go into this and see what comes out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Charlotte, Dr. Bob, and Dr. Marzuki, the 3 co-founders of the Ethics Council and Advisory for the ASEAN region. Well, our lovely audience on YouTube, if you have any questions in general or specifically to any speakers during the webinar, please feel free to write in the comments box. Finally, this webinar is recorded. So if you want to look back or you miss any part of during the live streaming, you can refer back to it on the AUN YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'm very delighted to present the recorded keynote speech of His Excellency Jose Ramos-Horta. He'll be joining us for the dialogue session with the speakers after the keynote. Everyone, please enjoy.
Good morning. This is Jose Ramos-Horta, former president of Timor-Leste. It is indeed a real pleasure, a privilege to join you all in this conversation on ASEAN ethical leadership and ethical leadership in ASEAN countries. Obviously, ASEAN being a very diverse organization, very diverse in its membership, it is extremely difficult for them to come together on a common vision. You have in ASEAN different political systems, one-party systems, semi-party system. You have a monarchy, and right now in Myanmar, there is a military regime that took over from an elected parliament-elected government. So it is an extraordinary times that require extraordinary vision, extraordinary leadership, and that easier said than done because Again, ASEAN is comprised a multitude of countries, of different cultures and different political systems and different styles of leadership. However, having said that, no matter what kind of political regime we are in, or no matter what kind of corporation we are in, or an academic institution, as long as we live together in a country, a society, in a government, in an institution, institutions of state or academic think tanks, there are some unavoidable principles, unavoidable qualities of leadership that would make a leader a successful one. For me, that's my personal view, because that's how I believe. The greatest quality of all for any leader in any country, society, institution, public or private, is genuine humility. Because if a person, a leader, is truly humble, genuinely humble, he or she will show even greater respect to those he or she lead. And by showing respect, you listen. And if you listen, you learn. And as you learn, you try to correct any mistakes that have been identified to you by those you were listening to. And as you have identified the mistakes with those you listen to, you are able to improve the management, your own leadership style, the productivity of the government or the institution. You create a much healthier environment for all and for the progress of the country, society, institution you are leading. So humility brings to governance, brings to a leadership extraordinary advantages. Humility means also you are against arrogance. You are against confrontation. You are against the temptation of wanting to hang on to power at any cost. Next is obviously that is connected with humility is compassion. How can a leader be successful if he or she is not animated, inspired by compassion? Compassion toward other human beings, towards the people who serve you, whom you are serving. Compassion to look at the suffering, the difficulties of the people around you. If you are leader of a country, compassion means you go beyond, go outside your palace, your throne, your five-star hotel, your mansion where you live as a leader. Go down to the valleys, to go down to the forest, to the village, and see your people. Descend from the mountain top, go to the valleys and look at the peasants, the people fetching water in the valley. Listen to them, talk to them. Next quality for me is passion. Yes, you have to be animated, motivated with passion, whatever you do. You cannot, the opposite of passion is boring. The opposite of passion maybe is laziness. So the other quality of leadership that I believe it's very important is that you are a passionate individual. You are passionate to serve others. You are passionate to defend the poorest of the poor, the handicapped people, and those who are less fortunate than you, than us, who have some physical disability or mental disability, not their fault. You have to show, to have passion to fight for them, for gender equality. You cannot be only humble. You cannot be only compassionate. You have to be animated with passion. You have to be a passionate fighter. And I believe if you are humble, if you are compassionate, if you're passionate, probably in itself, this means you have integrity. Because I don't see how a human being, a person, can be compassionate, can be humble, but at the same time is not honest, doesn't show integrity, absolutely cleanness in your political life, in your leadership. So integrity is a must in the quality of leadership. And that I go next to one of the qualities of leadership is or a necessity. Maybe this is no longer much to do with quality, because a person can be humble, can be compassionate, can be passionate and integrity, but is not a good communicator. A person, a leader may have all these other qualities, but unfortunately, he or she is not a great communicator, because a leader has to know how to communicate with clarity, communicate in short messages. Every word you use has a meaning. You do not communicate with demagogy, with boastful statements full of exaggerations. No, you have to be succinct. You have to be clear. You have to look at the people in the eyes. Of course, if you cannot look at them in the eyes because you are communicating via television or social media, your voice, your diction, the cadence, you know, the way you speak clearly, forcefully, but sometimes softly, depends what type of message or issue you are talking about. And let me share with you some concrete examples of leadership. Right now, ASEAN facing tremendous challenge, the challenge of the tragedy in Myanmar, a great country. A few years ago, there was the hope, the spring of democracy in 2015. In the course of those years of democracy spring, situation improved significantly in Myanmar. There was significant economic growth, improvements of people's lives, and in particular, there was a much more open up political atmosphere. There are hopes. All of this has been reversed. And that required now visionary leadership, courage, intelligence, honesty, integrity on the part of the leaders of ASEAN, but they require intelligence, wisdom on how to approach such a complex situation that respond to the suffering, the aspirations of the millions in Myanmar from all walks of life. women, men, youth, children, civil servants, bankers, farmers, artists, writers. It is extraordinary. Rarely I have seen in my lifetime such an all-encompassing movement of people. Because in many countries, some professional groups, they rarely get involved in what we call politics. They don't go to the street to demonstrate. In Myanmar, from A to Z, every professional category, every member of the communities of society, from poor to less poor, they are engaged and they are paying a price. And this calls for ASEAN leadership to show ethical leadership, to show courage, to show compassion, to show determination, to show passion on how to address and reverse the situation. I will not comment, that's not the purpose of my message today, whether what ASEAN leaders are doing merit my comment at this stage, but it is a test for ASEAN leaders. It's a test of leadership, and the quality of leadership that is being shown, that will be shown, the development of the situation on the ground will determine ASEAN centrality, ASEAN credibility. I go back to the point of that I mentioned, the other quality, humility. And that's an example, concrete example, a lesson of humility that I personally learned in my lifetime. In '95, just before the end of apartheid in South Africa, I went there. And that was before I won the Nobel Peace Prize, before the independence of my own country. I was relatively unknown to most people. But I went to South Africa and I was able to meet President Nelson Mandela. To make the story short, it was totally unexpected. I wanted to meet him, but he was extraordinarily busy. Besides, he was in hospital. And when he left hospital, I got a message from his office. The president wants to see you. I rushed to his residence, and there he was in bed, in his bedroom, recovering still from the surgery he had in the hospital. But he said, I know you wanted to see me very much. I heard about you, and I didn't want you to wait any longer. That's why I invited you to come right away and apologize for receiving you laying in my bed. What an extraordinary lesson of humility, of compassion from one of the greatest human beings of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. I leave this message with you all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was the inspiring message of His Excellency Ramos-Horta, the Nobel Peace Prize Laureate and the former President of Timor-Leste, to all the present and future leaders in ASEAN. Now he is with us here in Zoom. Your Excellency, it's a great pleasure and honor to warmly welcome you to the webinar on the ethical leadership of ASEAN and in ASEAN. And I would like to hand over the floor to the moderator, Dr. Bob, for the dialogue session. Dr. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellency, thank you very much for recording this. We were afraid that there might be technical problems, so we wanted to make sure that we had it right. But it's good to see you also live. And we'd like to have a few minutes together with myself and with the other panelists to have a sort of dialogue on ethics, and particularly the ethics in ASEAN. So you mentioned, first of all, that ethics is, in terms of a Nobel Peace Prize winner, it's not someone who, this is a very special kind of recognition of people, whatever profession, not politicians necessarily. They may be young, they may be old, but in Southeast Asia, we have two Nobel Peace Prize winners. You mentioned that one of them is being held as under arrest by the military government of Myanmar. What is the particular kind of leadership that is needed for someone like yourself, like Aung San Suu Kyi, in terms of ethics? It's not just knowing what to do, but it's also doing it, and you have to take action, and sometimes at great risk. Can you explain how this represents ethics in ASEAN? Please unmute your microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Again, situations vary from country to country, time to time, in terms of the historical times. These situations take place and develop. Very difficult to put myself in the position of Aung San Suu Kyi, whom I know well and whom I respect, and fully understand the challenges she faced when she was the state counselor after decades in isolation, and compare, let's say, with our own situation. We are a very small country, but I can speak only for myself. I cannot speak for all the agony, the conflicts that were going on in the heart and mind of Suu Kyi. For instance, for not speaking out on the Rohingya tragedy, for which she was amply criticized. Of course, she had no power at the time. Full power rested on the military. But as a political leader, you have to be wise. If you were to take a position very forcefully, speaking out, denouncing the military, and trying to protect the Rohingya, well, she could be out the next day, 2 days. The coup that happened in this year would have happened 5 years ago. So I can sympathize with that. So she was buying time, consolidate power, outmaneuver the military, and hoping that in the next election, which happened, she would get bigger majority and then begin the reforms. Regardless of what she did, should have done, didn't do, she got a mandate from the people, a second mandate, bigger than the first one. A coup is a coup. The military have zero authority, legitimacy to claim power. They took over, mishandled completely their own country, mishandled the economy, impoverished the people. They learn only to wage wars on the people, and impoverish them now. After 5 years of economic growth, the country, 90% of the economy paralyzed. So anyway, I didn't answer maybe exactly your question, but
from the human development point of view, also, there are quite a number of indicators of human development. Unfortunately, in Myanmar, all of them are negative at the present time, severely negative. We have a member of our panel who was involved in the United Nations investigation of the Rohingya movement, who you know very well, Dr. Marzuki, who also was collaborated with you at the beginning of Timor-Leste. I'll hand over to him in a second. I have one more question for you. ASEAN as a community, and it's considered in the world today the second most successful community of nations compared to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations has had crises as well. And you mentioned that we are in a critical situation in the history and the development of ASEAN as a community, for which Timor-Leste is a member to join, is a candidate to join. But ASEAN has often been criticized as being very good on adopting principles, but very poor at actually taking action. What has to change for ASEAN to be ethically regarded as a leader, as a community of leading nations in the world, in your opinion?
Well, I have to be frank, honest. Any profound change in mindset, in attitude, has to come from the people. We saw in Indonesia in 98, 99, only went so hard to fell because the people, the youth went to the streets, and then began this transition to democracy. And way back 20 years ago, I was saying, I have the fullest trust in the Indonesian society. Gradually, slowly, there will be accountability when civil society is stronger, institution will be stronger, democracy will be stronger. So Indonesia is a great example of people's power. Of course, like every situation, there will be setbacks. Look at the Philippines. Another great example of a very dynamic democracy started with the People's Revolution led by Cory Aquino, and who took over from her husband, Ninoy Aquino, whom I met in New York when he was in exile in Boston. And then there have been setbacks in the Philippines, but that's the path of democracy. And the lesson of Myanmar is that people realize right now they are literally alone. They cannot depend much on the international community. Yes, there have been actions taken on targeted sanctions, but an extraordinary movement from children and their moms and their dads to movie stars, to authors, to beauty queens, beauty princesses, models, bankers, an extraordinary movement. And they are a lot. They are more than 50 million. They will prevail. And then, yes, a great lesson will come out from Myanmar about ethical leadership in ASEAN.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure that the panelists have other questions, and I'd first like to turn to someone who has worked with you in the past, Dr. Marzuki Darusman. Marzuki, do you have any comments or questions for Ramos-Horta, please?
Yes, Bob, let me just thank you for the distillation of your experience as a leader of Timor-Leste. I was struck by the way you laid it out, that leadership requires communication skills. Now, many of us, or most of us perhaps, set out in life not to become leaders as such, but at times it's the condition and situation that pushes people to take on leadership roles, and therefore the sense is that leaders are born within a crisis. Now the question, and this goes to the heart of the issue, that of course leadership is required to promote ethics. But more to the point, to understand how leadership emerges, when you say that there's a great need for passion, otherwise it becomes boring. The moment I hear the word boring, I'm sorry to say, ASEAN comes to mind. So my question is, if you don't have a series of crises, how are leaders going to emerge? It's a flip side of the issue. Well, leaders come out from crisis, but there will be a crisis of leadership if you don't have crises that go into creating outstanding leaders. So it's a bit of a back and forth here. Now, how do we address this issue? Because that is, I think, a very telling situation that ASEAN is going through at the moment. So just a few tips from your perspective, Jose. Thanks.
I do not wish to overemphasize communication because, of course, in history, there have been great communicators and great failures, so I do not wish to emphasize this particular point. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, great communicators and great successes. Bung Karno in Indonesia, what a great communicator, a great orator. But I don't know whether he was very successful as a state builder and so on. So I do not wish to emphasize that, but only the point that you have to be able to communicate so that the people learn, hear, and they follow you. But there are other ways, probably. Marzuki, I know you from the Suharto era, and you and many others in Indonesia, who, in spite of the system of dictatorship, autocracy, you found courage, space to speak out, to stand for democracy in Indonesia, to stand for us, is Timor. I met you, in fact, in the corridors of the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. So I call you one of my mentors. And although I think we are about the same age, probably.
More or less.
But my point is to say that leaders are not only the ones holding state power. Leaders in universities, leaders in institutions that you serve and serve well, leaders in universities, leaders in corporations, leaders in the community. So I have had this experience in my own country during situation of crisis, where I work with local leaders, with the church leaders, I work with the village leaders to bring a pacification dialogue into communities that had problems. So I'm not referring only to the national leaders. So in ASEAN, beyond the presidents, prime ministers, and kings and princes, foreign ministers, there are the vast number of people, 600, 700 million. There are the tens of thousands of intellectuals, of academics, of business people, a powerful force. The state is an abstract concept, doesn't exist if it's not relied based on these people I mentioned. So institutions like this ASEAN network, are the beginning of how to shape the debate among ASEAN leaders in relation to human dramas. And that in Myanmar is one of them. Of course, I totally understand the difficulty, how to really protect the people in Myanmar, how to respond with consistency, with principles against the killings that's going on, how to respond to the head of Tatmadaw which promised to stop the murder, the killings, as called upon by ASEAN, as called upon by President Jokowi of Indonesia, Prime Minister of Malaysia, by Prime Minister of Singapore. But he's doing that. The killing is continuing. Torture is continuing. He's launching wars on his own people. The Tatmadaw leaders are launching wars on their own people. They are not launching a war of defense against an external enemy. So how you can stop that? That is extraordinarily difficult. And I know ASEAN leaders are agonizing over it. And I do not wish in a public forum appear to be judgmental on the dilemma ASEAN leaders are facing. But the reality is, this is an existential crisis. The way Myanmar progresses, develop in the next few weeks, few months, will determine the ethos, the centrality, the credibility of ASEAN.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, but I want to have time for one more question, because in our panel we have really leaders of ASEAN institutions, which may or may not be boring, but they certainly have ethical roles. And we also have the younger generation as well. So Myanmar constitutes possibly a crisis. I lived in the European Union for 30 years. There have been the crisis of Brexit. More recently, there was the crisis of the euro. We will have more crises as well. So I'm not worried about running out of crises in ASEAN. We have the COVID, we have many long-term crises as well. But let me turn to the panelists who are representing those institutions. Do you have any questions or comments? Here I mean Dr. Yang from the ASEAN Foundation, Gil Gonzalez from the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, or Dr. Focus from the ASEAN University Network. Anything you would like to add or say, or disagree? And the other crisis, the other representatives that we have in our panel who may want to ask questions are the next generation. So we have two young people, one from the Philippines, one from Malaysia. Do you have any questions or comments? Anyone from the panel?
Yes, I do actually, Dr. Bob, if that's all right.
Thank you, Raudhah.
Yes, Excellency, Mr. President. I think the question that came to mind when I was listening to your keynote speech about the characteristic of an ethical leader, I cannot help myself but to think about the next generation of future leaders of ASEAN, meaning my generation or the next and younger. And I wanted to see, or I wanted to sort of understand your thoughts as to whether or not the generation now, meaning millennials and Gen Z, are they, in your opinion, ethical, given that we live in an instant gratification world where a lot of times, we are very much guilty of doing something out of fame, out of popularity, which I believe is not ethical. But yes, I wanted to sort of understand your perspective better in terms of whether you see the next generation of ASEAN leaders, whether they are ethical, and if they are not, in your opinion, what are perhaps the missing characteristics that we must fill in? Excellency, sure. Mr. President.
We'll keep it short because we have other panelists, but Excellency, this is a question I wanted to ask, so I'm glad you asked it, Raudhah. Thank you. What about the next generation?
Maybe in fairness to other speakers, you might wish to let them ask questions so that and then I try to answer in one go, short, all the questions.
Anyone else have questions?
Yes, Excellency. Thank you. This is Gil Gonzalez. My question is, if you were in ASEAN, what would you have done with regard to Myanmar? Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go with those two unless someone else has something. Okay. Shall we go with those?
So I answer?
Please, go ahead, yes.
Okay. Well, both questions are very difficult, put me on the spot to answer, particularly the second one. Yeah, a cynical person, the friend who asked the question is very diplomatic, very, yeah, but he could have said, yes, Mr. Ramos-Horta, you spoke so well. Now, how are you going to resolve the Myanmar question? And I presume if any foreign minister of ASEAN listening right now, they'll be curious, yes? Mr. Ramos-Horta spoke so eloquently, now give us some ideas. What would you do? And I could give you a demagogic, easy answer. You know, I could say, like Mahathir said a few years ago in the height of the Rohingya crisis, expel Myanmar from ASEAN and suspend the leadership. And in the height of a crisis of the Rohingya in Myanmar, Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, went to the streets demonstrating against the situation. Difficult to give an intelligent, wise answer, but I would say if I were any meaningful, relevant leader in ASEAN, I would say, and bearing in mind the extraordinary difficulties, if the membership of ASEAN, the 10 countries cannot be more different from each other, and with different interests. Those who have closest borders, those who have actual physical borders with Myanmar have different concerns. Indonesia is farther away, is the biggest country, 270 million, etc. But I would answer it this way. Today in ASEAN, there is a country, Indonesia, 270 million, that has transitioned from dictatorship in the past to what today is a dynamic, maybe imperfect democracy. It's a multicultural, multi-religion country, coexisting millions of people of different religions coexist in that, although Muslims are the overwhelming majority. In spite of the problems Indonesia faced over the years and still face, it is a shining example of a successful transition from dictatorship, military rule to democracy. You don't hear much of the military today talking politics in Indonesia. In fact, I never heard for many years now anyone talking politics. So this is a show of these changes. So Indonesia is in the best possible position. It doesn't have a vested interest with Myanmar, doesn't share any border with Myanmar. It is a major power in the region, member of G20. So it has to be taking a more forceful leadership role in financial. And the solution has to be return to democracy, to return to Suu Kyi, NLD, those who won the elections. Otherwise, you're creating precedents. They allow for coups to continue. So that's my only answer to the second question. To the first question, I go back to what I said. Changes in ASEAN, the mindset depends on the youth. Your question is whether I believe that the youth of ASEAN countries, well, depends. I will judge, depends on how you people, the young people throughout ASEAN, react to the situation in Myanmar. If you show sensitivity, if you show anger, if you show compassion, if you go to the streets, if you forget for a moment the comfort of your lives in your respective countries, show solidarity to the young people of Myanmar in big numbers. Don't protest only in Indonesia when Israelis do something grave, serious in Gaza. You have to protest also in your own backyard. When the people of Myanmar, of the majority ethnic group, but also the minority groups, nationality, Myanmar are suffering. Yeah, that is a test of ethical principles of the young generation in ASEAN countries. If you're too busy in your middle-class lives, if you're too busy in the comfort of your material life to bother about Myanmar, well, that's all, tell all about you, where you are today, and I'm sorry, not great prospects for the future.
Thank you, Excellency, and Jose Ramos-Horta for participating in this. I hope you can stay with us for the views of the other panelists. We have quite a lot of panelists today representing different aspects of ethical leadership in ASEAN. And so I'd like to move on to that.
Yeah.
And please feel free to jump in if you have anything to say. Now, our next speaker is Gil Gonzalez, Executive Director. Sorry.
Dr. Bob, just may I intervene? Before we proceed to the next session, I would like to take a memorable group photo for all the speakers together with His Excellency.
All right.
Yes. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your wisdom and the inspiring messages, which is something to keep in mind, not only for political leaders, but also leaders from all other sectors, including the young leaders. And before we proceed to the panel discussion, I would like to call upon Your Excellency to stay on with us with all the speakers. We will have a group photo session. So please make sure that your camera are on, and I will count 1 up to 3. 1, 2, 3. Smile. One more time. 3, 2, 1. Smile. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much, His Excellency, and all the speakers. May I hand over the floor to Dr. Bob?
Thank you. And again, thank you, Ramos-Horta, Excellency, for a very frank and very honest and very pointed point on particular historical situation that we're in right now in ASEAN. Now, let me turn to our first panelist, Gil Gonzalez. You're the Executive Director of the ASEAN Business Advisory, called ASEAN BAC, which is mandated by the ASEAN leaders to pursue strategic policy under the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint for 2025. Throughout your career, you've been an expert in corporate governance, strategic and corporate planning, and an advocate for governance reforms in business. You're a regular speaker on business, and you work on ASEAN policy and reform. What we have spoken about is that we've spoken largely about politics, but one of the things that is quite obvious with the AEC is that business and economics represent also a driving force. And the question is whether this driving force is also an ethical driving force. We're seeing a huge number of changes in ethics and a lot of talk about ethics in companies. So please, can you tell us more about what you do and how you see ethics in ASEAN, ethical leadership? Over to you, Jim.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Bob, especially to ECAR and to your collaborators for putting this webinar together. So may I go to my next slide, please? This is my flight plan. Very simply, my takeoff point is I call the govern, which is ASEAN. Because after all, I see ASEAN as the beneficiary precisely of leadership. So we'll just go briefly into where is ASEAN now, and during the pandemic, and where do we want to go? The next is the governance infrastructure, because the question is it ethical leadership alone? It's like having a Formula One car and having it drive through an alley or a very small street. Does it serve its purpose? Or it just becomes a decoration? Or worse, it becomes a distraction. So how does it make a difference? And then the third is, I'll try to land the presentation to the regional leadership qualities. But then we need to have a handle on whether it's just a concept, is it an abstract, or what are the factors that come into play which defines leadership, especially in the ethical dimensions and so on. Now, of course, at that part, it can be a bit preachy, which I hope you won't mind. Next slide, please. So every time, as I go through the slides, there will be some snippets of leadership qualities in addition to what Excellency Jose Ramos-Horta has mentioned. So the governed, we're talking of ASEAN. This is before the pandemic, and ASEAN was still in a sweet spot. What do I mean? Growing at 5% per year, we're expected to be the fourth largest economy in the world by 2030. So that's quite a trajectory. And that the heart of that sweet spot is our very young demographic. So all of you who are listening, you are the market. You are the future of ASEAN, which makes it so attractive. And of course, you are our future leaders. Next slide, please. This is the context, or what I call the ASEAN playing field. This is before the pandemic. So what is the environment? There's a shift towards multipolar global governance. So meaning to say multilateralism has been put to risk, given the model that US, the predecessor of President Biden, has led. The US way, the American way, the America First way. So there's a pullback on globalization, a pullback on open dialogue and collaboration. So there is a risk. The fourth industrial revolution, which was at that time knocking our doors, now we embrace it. And we have to take that opportunity to make it beneficial for all of us. So there's rising protectionism and unilateralism, as I just mentioned, and the rising sustainability concerns. So now there's the race to zero, meaning to say to have zero carbon emission by 2050, which is a very serious target. It's a race we cannot afford not to join. Next slide, please. So the AEC Blueprint 2025 is what I call the job description of the leader, both at national and regional level. It talks of developing policy environment, improves productivity, role of the global economy. So the leader of today cannot just focus on its domestic concerns, purely parochial. A leader should now think global, given the borderless world that we now have. Next slide, please. So where is ASEAN now? So ASEAN, together with the rest of the world, has been brought to its knees, given the pandemic. So you see the dive, the GDP, negative 3.3 in 2020. And the projection for this year is being pushed back simply because the COVID, the pandemic, has not been fully managed, simply because of the growing mutations that are happening and so on. So again, recovery may come a little bit longer. Next slide, please. So those are the elements that have been hit. GDP down, tourism and travel, the worst hit sector, trade down, inflow of foreign direct investments down. Now, what is the lesson? Of course, in any tragedy, in any crisis, there's always the opportunity to find out if this risks if these weaknesses can precisely become our strengths moving forward. Next slide. So there's a big slowdown. While of course there are achievements, 54% of the blueprint is, well, this is ASEAN Secretariat declaring it has been completed. There are 34% in progress, and some have been eliminated. So a good leader monitors. A good leader finds out and measures the progress so that he knows whether he is advancing or whether he's not moving, or worse, if he's reversing. Next slide, please. So these are now the big words that we see post-COVID. Everybody's trying to think outside of the pandemic. So the sooner we get out, the better. So digital transformation, you talk of green recovery, inclusive, sustainable industries, full recovery, 4IR, innovation, and so on. And of course, we should never forget that in all of these mega trends, ASEAN centrality should always be pursued. Next slide, please. Now, where do we go? A good leader has that medium to long-term goal. And ASEAN, when it comes to planning, when it comes to coming up with frameworks, action plans, ASEAN shines. No better, I think, can compare to ASEAN coming with the most beautifully worded and well-written declarations, directions, and so on. They're fantastic, okay? But of course, there are problems. You can be a good communicator, you can be a good, eloquent planner, but end of the day, if execution is not there, you fall short. Next slide, please. Now let's take a brief look at the governance infrastructure. There are limitations. As we know, the ASEAN Way, based on the launched ASEAN's 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, there are three bedrock pillars there which are good, but in a way provide some limitations. The principle of sovereign equality for all its members. Number two, the non-interference in the internal affairs of one another. That's why His Excellency mentioned that everyone is in a dilemma. They're agonizing what to do because there are these restrictions. And third, the consensus diplomacy, meaning a single nation can have an effective veto power. So if it's not 10, it's not ASEAN. Unlike APEC, APEC is more of a moral suasion encouragement platform, meaning to say, those who want to move forward will move forward. And they will move forward with or without you. It's your call. You just wait on the sideline, that's your business. But of course, we have to accept the reality in ASEAN where every measure has to be ratified. Most of them need to be ratified by their respective lawmakers, their Congress and so on, which makes it very politically charged. In fact, the matter in globalization is for me a political suicide for any leader to come to face his constituents every election and say, we will open the market, we will open agriculture because we need cheap and better quality products. You say that and you're dead because people want protection. And of course, what's the other side of protection? They don't grow. They don't become efficient. They're babies who don't grow up. So those are the hard realities on the ground. Next slide, please. And of course, there's bureaucracy. I have nothing against bureaucracy if it works. For me, that's the only. Now, if it ain't, now, as they say in leadership, if it ain't broke, why fix it? But now the trend is different. If it ain't broke, you might as well break so it can fly higher. So these are now the new concepts that are bearing on all of us. Next slide, please. So there's governance and execution risk. So any leader, must be able to have that organizational acumen. He's not there for the big words, he's not there for, but end of the day is will he be able to deliver? Okay, so now ASEAN BAC has been able to go really drill down and tell, can you go to the next slide, please? How do you address execution risks? The problem is there is no chief executive officer in the whole ASEAN ecosystem. You have leaders who give directions. You have a secretariat who just follows up and does not have the power to execute, because execution still lies with the 10 member states. But there's no one. End of the day, will say, this is what will have to happen. This is what we want to see in terms of very concrete measures. No one's doing that. So everybody, goes at its own pace. And all this time, where is harmonization happening? Of course, some countries can be very fast. And of course, we have to fully understand the emerging and developing economies. It will take time to narrow the gap between them. But what we need in ASEAN is an action. Of course, we're unlike EU, okay? Wherein there's one customs system, okay? One customs dealing with everybody, same rules, same application, same interpretation. We don't have that. So we thought that there's this high-level commission, but this is for another webinar, I think, for fuller explanation. Next slide, please.
Okay, then we'll...
Next slide, please. Now, I go to the heart of the matter. What is the leadership qualities we're looking about? And I say, is it a reality or concept? You look at any website, and how do you argue about leadership traits? All of them really applies. So I look at this from Andrea Schwartz and say, look at the first four: charismatic, team-oriented, participative, humane, fantastic. But then there's the lower two, which is autonomous leadership, a strong man, okay? And the self-protective leadership, okay, that has to be a bit of inward looking. Right. But for me, leadership is how do you use any of these, which is called for by the situation. These are roles which you can execute and play. Now, next slide, please. I'm into my last two slides.
Okay.
So in this, what are the ethical dimensions? For me, it's a given, as I always say, because we know the story of those who become unethical, who become corrupt, they either fall into scandal and implosion. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. For me, leadership is anyone who can move us towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. And ethics is how do you get to those three bedrock values. So everything else is style, is approach, is tactics. But what for me important, how do we measure it, is bring them to what is good, the true, and the beautiful. And of course, all of us needs coaching. So if you need to be coached, you need a mentor, you talk to Bob. That's my presentation, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. And in the interest of time, those of you who are in the audience, if you have questions, please post those questions now. And I'll ask one quick question before we move on because we're running out of time. But basically, one of the key challenges of business in ASEAN has been corruption. But now we're starting to see a movement away, and thanks to the governance and the improvement of business, regulations, reporting, etc., it hasn't disappeared. It never disappears completely. But there's another ethical issue that is coming to the fore, which is what is business doing as a positive good? And this is particularly in the minds of the younger generation, Gen Z, who say, why would I join a business? Why should I work for a company? I want to change the world. I want to make the world a better place. What are the key dialogue? What are the key questions that you're asking yourself amongst business leaders in the ASEAN BAC concerning this sort of positive ethical contribution?
Well, get good governance, which is an element of ethics as well. It's been a strongly worded concept, and there are programs that supports what I call the ESG, environment, socials, and government, and governance. So at the bottom of all those, at the heart of those, of course, is ethics, taking care of your planet, taking care of your people, taking care of profits. So they may not come out as a very clear we need to a values change, values formation in terms of programs, in terms of nice statements. But when you look at the construct of looking towards sustainability, where ESG, environment, social, are at the very heart of it, I think it already makes it very eloquent that ASEAN is for the good.
Thank you, Gil. We'll be moving on next to the pillar now. The ASEAN BAC represents the second pillar of ASEAN, which is the ASEAN Economic Community. In ASEAN, there's an organization that's been created that has no equivalent in the other regional organizations, such as the EU, which is the ASEAN Foundation. And the executive director is Dr. Mee Eng. Dr. Yang has worked in private and public sectors over her 26 years, starting in media. She's devoted her early career in business development manager at the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation. She's become the CEO of GameView, the largest mobile game publisher in Malaysia. She was recently senior vice president of AlphaCap and is part of the international advisory panel for the Malaysia Communication and Multimedia Commission at the University of Tenaga National and University of Kuala Lumpur. Dr. Yang, welcome to the panel, and can you give us your perspective on ASEAN leadership? And I know that it's directly related to the mission of the ASEAN Foundation. So can you tell us more about that, please?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dr. Bob. It has been a very heavy morning. I hope everyone now can relax a little bit, because I'm not going to give you very controversial perspective, because ASEAN Foundation is very much into development. So we are into motivating, we are into creating new generations of leaders. So of course, this morning we have, His Excellency Jose, and also Dr. Marzuki and Gil, has given their perspective on ASEAN leaderships. I think you have already been injected enough of the what is happening right now. So for me, I wanted to share a little bit of what I have prepared for you. Just a little introduction on, if you are not aware, but I think most of you are aware, what is ethical leaderships? First of all, leads by examples, and then guides and inspires, nurtures and empowers and strives, for the rights. So why is it ASEAN so important? It's a community of opportunities, like what we say is a sweet pot, by a previous speaker. Robust, more than 600 million people. And we have gone so long, so many histories, 5 decades already. So we have achieved a lot. So beside all whatever has been said about ASEAN, the leadership's issues and challenge, I think it is not only ASEAN per se. In the whole world, leaderships now is put into test.
Yes.
Everyone is having the same issues, let alone political issues, economy and social impact issues. So I would not want to dwell into, looking into how good each of the organization in the world is doing, because everyone has their challenges. So for us, it's how are we going to proceed further, move forward? Of course, leadership, a very good leaders needed to drive, to be at the pilot, to be at the front and drive the movement. Where is the direction you want to go? So as we have already known, dynamic and diverse. When there is a place where it is very diverse, it bounds to have a lot of conflicts and very hard to manage. So diversification gives you a lot of good things, but also give you a lot of challenges. As a leader, you are put into test when you have diversifications. So as an ASEAN Foundation person, I lead my small team, very lean. So for us, communication is very important. I echo the word Dr. Jose has been talking. Communications and directly to your team right now. And not only to my team, to also my stakeholders, my board of trustees, the 10 ASEAN, and member states, the ambassadors. I report to 10 bosses. So for us, For ASEAN Foundation, as a leader, as a medium, I will consider myself as a medium because I have to manage the top, manage the bottom. So diversifications. And also my stakeholders is the youth for now. Yeah? And then also because of pandemic, we also extended our support to cover all other communities, especially the marginalized group, like women, handicaps and all. So if you are looking, it depends on what kind of scope you put in ASEAN. If you are looking at it as a good place, as a good perspective, then you will see a good things. If you look at it at the other perspective, maybe there is always a challenges there. So why is it so important to have a good leaderships? Because at this moment, encourage positive culture, working culture. Because if you create a scary place, worry, everybody is already have enough in their plates, of the pandemic, trying to survive. So as a leader, your job is to have a soft landing for everyone, a cushion for everyone. So for us, it's like to create, first of all, with your team is to have a positive working culture and environment. And then we also have to boost our reputations. During this pandemic time also, I mean that as a leader myself, I look at it also as an opportunity, Dr. Bob, because, okay, the pandemic, we don't know when it's going to finish. So many people say that, okay, during pandemic, what you should do, we should actually increase our resilience, learn more, empower ourselves, give ourselves more time to learn and to actually learn more technologies, perhaps tools and all that as a leader, so that you can use the tools to benefit your people, your organizations, and also your stakeholders. So we also want to cultivate loyalty. Okay, many bosses out there, because I have many friends who work in organization, they told me that, we have to go back to work, our bosses pay us money, they make sure you have to go back. But the bottom line is, loyalties come during this time. I mean, how good is the organizations and leaderships is put to test during this time. How you take care of your staff. You want to keep good people with you. You're not trying to lose your good people, to the market. Believe me, once the economy build again, come back again to, I think not normal, a new world, people is going to leave your organization if you do not look after them. Because people will remember the hardship that they have gone through with you during this pandemic time, okay? So as a leader, be more empathy, passionate, genuine, as what His Excellency Jose has mentioned, compassion and respect. So increase morals and improve productivity. If you are a business owner, even you are NGOs, CSOs, in all organizations, this kind of importance of leaderships and moral building is very crucial right now. So what are the essentials? I will not go into each of them, just a bit. Some put in different kinds of elements there, essential elements, but I put honesty, justice, respect, community, and integrity, because this applies to ASEAN Foundation as a NGO and as an ASEAN Charter or ASEAN body. So we look into community in the sense that it's not only community in our own office, organization, but community outside, our stakeholders. People who we cannot reach, we are thinking ways how we can reach. So we rely a lot on partnerships right now, and also on mobilize our alumni, our youth, to help us do a lot of things for us, because we can't travel, limitations and all that. So community building, respect, it's very important. You respect other people's view and how they do things. Honesty, of course, all this comes, as a given. You have to be, honest when you want to do good jobs, because if you have a personal interest in it, it's already diverted. Your focus is already wrong. So what are the impact of leadership's positive impact on 3 levels, as we mentioned: team, individual, and then the organizations. So if you want to create a positive work environment for individuals to grow, during this time, I think it's important also to look at your team, who you want to grow, who you want to groom to take over your place. like what Ambassador mentioned, His Excellency Jose mentioned, do not hold on to your power, power craze, I mean, power is with us now as a leader, but power will leave us one day also. We will retire, the new one will replace us, So just nurture a new leaders, that is what my focus, in this organization right now. And then cultivate trust among the team. I mean, the office politics happens, but try not to enhance the politics, Try not to make it bigger and play one of the roles inside. Now, this is very damaging. For me, office politics is very costing, a lot of energies in the organizations, which is unnecessary for now. So we also can build a good reputation, because later I will dwell a little bit into ESG, a lot of fundings and partners coming from outside looking at how important, your organization is achieving in ESG, because one of the elements in the ESG governance side is leadership. That's why it is interlinked. And ASEAN Foundation, we actually highlight a lot. Ethical leaderships, not only myself, but also my managers who actually manage the team. So it has got different kinds of level of leaderships. So we wanted to have fairness, solidarity among member states. We have to look after all 10 member states. So we have to be fair most of the time and respect. But one thing good about ASEAN, my board of trustees, just to share with you, is they have never questioned me on how come you have the programs launched in this country, but not in my country. There's never these questions. So they are always looking at overall, so it's a consensus. Okay, your country needs more help, therefore the programs will go to your country, or this country is better in this, and then we leverage on the resources from this country. So it is actually a mix and match. You are the cook as a leader. How you want to cook your dish, how you want to mix and match. It is very important. So for us, is to boost the productivity, also important, to have a good leadership and builds positive reputation. Because if an organization has so many issues, so many politics happens, and outside people, your partners, your funders see that, oh my God, it's a chaotic organization. People will not want to fund you. So the image, reputation is very important, and how you manage the fund, transparency, dignity, integrity, all this comes into place. Set good example for young people. This is very important, because I have always tell my team, be the good leader for the youth, because when they are the project manager, they are actually the leader of the programs. So the youth will look highly upon them, because they will be communicating with the youth. So all my leaders, in my organization has to set a good example. So we also provide ideal state of mind to serve the community, because later you will see some of our young people will share their views, our young leaders, because when we want to actually create a good leaders, we have to provide a state of mind that, the suitable state of mind to serve the community, because not everyone wanted to serve the community. As I always mention to youth that comes forward and ask me how I want to do volunteering work, how I want to be involved, how I want to take part. I say, okay, first of all, if you want to join my organization, you have to have the right mindset. You are not looking at money. You don't want to get rich only, You can manage your money, of course, when you get the salary, how you manage your wealth. But if you want to be business rich and work with the NGOs, it's not there. So it's a community, serving the community, passion.
Dr. Yang, we're running out of time. So around those ethical principles, you've built some programs and you have a number of priorities. Can you tell us briefly what those are?
Okay, Dr. Bob, we have a few kinds of programs. We look into leaderships. If you look at the item enhanced leadership skills in the right column, we have like ASEAN Foundation Model ASEAN meeting is to build the future leaders. future leaders in ASEAN. So based on consensus and diplomacy. Okay, so if there is a challenge now, I mean, I put it to the audience, if there is a challenge and say, okay, ASEAN, we don't want diplomacy, we don't want consensus, we want change. Okay, break and change, as what Dr. Gil has mentioned. What kind of break and change? You know, it's easy to say, but what is the best alternative are you suggesting? You know, so if there is a constructive suggestions, perhaps we can consider, you know, because we are building another set of, I would say, some say boring leaders. I don't think it's a boring leaders. I think boring or not, it's up to you how you look at your jobs every day. You know, if you go and work every day and you feel bored, you start with the boring steps. I assure you, you will be boring. So we have also Empowering Youth by Maybank Foundation. I have many Maybank Foundation people listening to me. So thanks to them, they actually funded the Empowering Youth for youth to lead the programs and to change the community to betterment. So we have also some programs now, a social enterprises program to also build the future youth business people. That means you have social responsibility, making money at the same time, you have the social development, social impact measurement in your KPI. So we also have data science by SAP, our partners, and also many other partners like Connect ASEAN for cultural side. Okay, for me, cultural intelligence is very important in ASEAN. When you want to be a leader in ASEAN, you better have a good cultural intelligence. You have to understand other people's differences and accept and respect their differences. Yeah, so I think, Bob, I would just go for my maybe last slide on ESG a bit, okay. Environmental, social, and governance. So in the future, if you are running organizations or business or non-business, three things you have to look at it, because these three things will be the one that indicates whether you are a sustainable organization. So you have good governance, ethical, high ethical is really needed for that. So environment, social impact, people measure by that, beside measuring using money. So these are what the company organization will be measured in the future. So I think that's all from my sharing. These are future challenges. I just put it for you to read yourself because of the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. We're a little bit over time, and I want to invite all of the participants to ask questions, particularly for different panelists, because you've seen what they are talking about, what their point of view is, and also what they're representing. And I'd like to move on now to our next panelist, Dr. Marzuki Darusman, who was founder and subsequent chair of the Indonesian National Human Rights Commission in 1993. In 1996, he was on the ASEAN Regional Working Group that led to the formation of the current ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission for Human Rights, called AICHR, AICHR, which is an institution within ASEAN on human rights. And for the United Nations, he's been on the Secretary General's Expert Commission to investigate the death of Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. That was in 2011. And more relevantly for our discussion today, in 2018, Marzuki Darusman chaired the independent international fact-finding mission on Myanmar for the United Nations Human Rights Council on the Rohingya human rights violations. His vision on the importance of ethics is an ASEAN need and directly led to the creation of ICAR, as we've seen. Dr. Marzuki Darusman, over to you, please.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you too for the two speakers who have, I think, very helpfully and usefully laid out the theme of the webinar, which is ethical leadership in ASEAN. We heard from Jose earlier vision of what leadership is all about, and therefore I would perhaps like to, in a way, draw attention to the other dimension of this theme. While the emphasis has been on leadership, ethical leadership, perhaps the term could also be understood as leadership of ethics in ASEAN.
Yeah.
Which is what I might want to go into, just to complement the views on the theme that has been brought out very nicely by the previous speakers. And to start also by explaining why, when I had this chance to dialogue with Jose, that the term boring, is applied to the way things are being done here for the last perhaps 50 years plus since ASEAN was conceived and established. It was not meant as a belittling term, but you see, just looking at the workings of a beehive, you have all these bees working unceasingly, boringly, but at the end, you create honey. So with that, I'd like to just continue where the previous speakers left off, especially the business outlook, perception, or angle on ethical leadership, which has been brought out by Gil earlier. And this is by way of introducing first, who's one other founder, at least Dr. Makarimi Bisono. I believe Dr. Young, he was your predecessor, and I had the honor to work together with him, and now he is also one of the founders of this organization that I lead, which was established in the wake of the United Nations Human Rights Council adopting what is now known, and this, of course, Jill would know this, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is a watershed because as of 2011, the area of protection of human rights experienced a very major shift. Protection then became more focused on prevention of human rights transgression, which is somewhat contrasting with the previous period of human rights work focused on advocacy. With the UNGPs in place, human rights protection really focused on and converged on the issue of risk. It was not enough from there on to look into violations of human rights after the fact. It needed a different approach, and that is to see how human rights could be prevented from happening, and that leads us to the need for reporting, because that is the key to ensure that human rights transgressions can be prevented in a much better way than addressing it when it already happens. And therefore, the focus on impacts in the past has now shifted to the issue of risk and harm. And this is the entry point towards ethics. And that is that when you have the notion of harm as a focus, doing no harm is the primary ethical precept. And therefore, it makes the point that business ethics, harm is a very fertile area for ethical reflection. And you have business over the years developing hundreds of platforms on business ethics that business have referred to in trying to comply with human rights, international human rights. Now, having said that, I would like to just go to the heart of the discussion today and focus, as I mentioned earlier, on the leadership of ethics to complement ethical leadership in terms of leaders expected to conduct themselves in an ethical manner, which has been amply brought out by the previous speakers. Now, I'm not in any way trying to go into a discourse on ethics, of course, because that will take up too much time. And but basically relating ethics to ASEAN, and this is for purposes of just opening up the discussion. We'll go into this much deeper into in the Q&A. Is that the ASEAN was established in 1967, 50 years ago plus, on the basis of fear of communism. That was the motivating force that led to ASEAN being established. And for the last 50 plus years, ASEAN was developed and built on the basis of what could be called an anxiety syndrome, that unity of ASEAN could only be ensured if internally it was also secured by what may be termed as an ordering paradigm that would ensure a lockstep process, a political process of all the ASEAN members in their political development within their respective countries. And therefore, over the last 50 years plus, while professing to commit itself to democracy and human rights, it was more in terms of an ideal, value ideal commitment, rather than a policy or principle of action. Now, this changed fundamentally in 2007. This is fast forward from 67. And that is when the ASEAN Charter was enunciated and called for the establishment of a human rights, ASEAN human rights body, which Bob mentioned in the introduction. And therefore, to contrast this, I have a slide up there which pictures the situation before 2007, an ASEAN which is based on one vision, one identity, and one community, which went out from an ethics of order, an ethics of fear and order, where ethics was in dispute. Ethics didn't have a place in the politics of ASEAN. It was considered as an obstacle because ASEAN had to contend with external pressures, but also from internal sources, and therefore each country, member country, had to just fend for themselves and how to cope with their dynamics. Law during that period was more of an ordering tool rather than being led towards instituting justice. And politics, the whole idea of politics was consensus. I think Gil mentioned this earlier in his term as consensual diplomacy. And so this was the state of play. Now, as of 2007, when the human rights body was established, ASEAN then clearly came out with a new outlook and open up space for ethics. There was a place for ethics in politics again, and authoritarian governance moved over and evolved into much more democratic governance, and human rights was more than just words. And now, going back to what Jose was mentioning earlier on Myanmar, there is a limit to state sovereignty of non-interference, and this was brought out again by the previous speakers, and therefore the test, of course, is that to what extent is this new leaf that has opened up since 2007 up to now, how far have we gone in promoting ethics within ASEAN? Now, the next slide, please. Now, just to highlight the debate, I'd like just to draw attention to what a former foreign minister from Thailand has stated in recent times, in fact, 3 days ago. And he was asking whether in dealings with the situation in Myanmar, should ASEAN be transformed or should it be replaced? And therefore, next slide, please. And therefore, there is a need now to reimagine ASEAN as we move forward. And that is to move from an ethics of order to an ethics of freedom and openness, allowing dignity, social justice to flourish. And therefore, three matters come out for discussions. We need to have a vision, which is it goes out from this view that it is diversity in unity that we are striving for. Not quite unity in diversity, but it's diversity in unity. Perhaps to picture that much more simply, we're looking at a mosaic rather than a melting pot process in ASEAN. Secondly, there's a need to develop a moral imagination of solidarity, and this goes again back to what Jose was mentioning: compassion. While compassion may be a personal trait of good leadership, solidarity brings out the collective commitment towards each other. And now, finally, coming to the climax or the high point of the presentation, and this is going over to the next speakers who are more useful speakers than the previous one. There is a need, to really voice much more the voice of the younger generation, because the impression is that for so many years, ASEAN has generated a meek and timid generation, which is who are visibly challenged in expressing their concerns for their fellow human beings, their plight, their suffering, for whatever reason. It has become a silent generation, apart from being cognizant that the path forward in terms of social mobility is to pursue a career as a manager, as a professional. But if the younger generation do not take up leadership in this sense of being empathizing and concerning for others, then the society will start breaking up, and that is a self-defeating endeavor. If you continue just on this track that has been laid out by an ASEAN that has thrived in a way, and this is Dr. Young's picturing of where ASEAN is today in terms of its economic progress, is undeniable. But we are approaching a high point where it will be very critical for the youth also to take up political leadership in ASEAN. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. So, Dr. Marzuki, you've been able to tell us about the history of ASEAN, about the fundamental shift in human rights, and about the reimagination of ASEAN, and you've left a major challenge to the next generation, and I will now turn to the next generation. Our next two panelists represent that generation. I'm not sure they are so meek and timid as, but maybe they're not exemplary. Raudhah Nazran is the founder of Accelerate Global, and I must say I'm proud that she's also on the board of the AHDO Malaysia as a representative for that next generation of leadership. She's been a government scholar in law in the United Kingdom. She started the social enterprises while she was a student there. She's spoken on youth and human rights in the United Kingdom Parliament, in the United Nations Human Rights Conference in the UK, and at the Asian Development Bank. She's an advocate for change and youth employment and empowerment, founder of the Accelerate Global social enterprise, which tackles youth unemployment, particularly for disadvantaged. So over to you, Raudhah, and do you take up this challenge? Welcome.
Oh, thank you so very much, Bob. I do, and I wanted to say, I do hope that my presence today sort of proved Dr. Marzuki otherwise, and that I'm not meek and timid, and I do hope that my presence does carry a little bit of weight as to sort of, challenging that particular statement. Now, to begin with, I think, Dr. Bob, it's pertinent for me to highlight to my esteemed panel as well as the audience that my presentation today might differ from perhaps the rest of my esteemed panel, as I do not have any slides. I thought what I do wish to do is to focus for all of us, myself included, on what I'm about to say, because what I do wish to do, Dr. Bob, ladies and gentlemen, is to leave all of you today with a question that I believe is in dire need of an answer. And only us can answer this question, I believe. Now, when asked to speak about the ethical leadership of ASEAN and in ASEAN today by Dr. Bob, I couldn't help myself but to think, is the current generation, mine, and the next, are we ethical? The reason why is because the future of ASEAN is already here. People my age and younger, those who are in university and in high school, those are the future leaders of ASEAN, and whether we agree to admit it or not, they are. And then sooner or later, they are, and they will be taking the reins. And the question that we've got to ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, is not just if they are prepared to become ASEAN leaders, but rather if they are prepared to become ethical leaders of ASEAN. Now, to address the elephant in the room, and having talked about this with Dr. Bob and my other esteemed panel, in which was also mentioned by Excellency Dr. Jose, the whole world is currently looking at ASEAN. And is currently obviously observing our actions, particularly with what's happening in Myanmar, where human rights is being severely questioned. Now, not forgetting the issue of statelessness in Malaysia that has been going on for many, many years, underage marriage, corruption, democracy in question, and the list goes on. All of which begs the question of what are the current ASEAN leaders and what are the future ASEAN leaders doing to put an end to all these issues. Now, ethical leadership to me, of course, comes in very handy when we ask this question. And as a young woman, and I believe I represent the younger generation out there as well, since I am 25, so I still am a youth, ethical leadership to me is about fighting against injustices. And ethical leaders to me is someone who fight to put an end to injustices and not focus on doing what is right politically, but rather what is right for the community and for the citizens at large. Now, in this case, I refer to my Prime Minister, Tan Sri Dato Sri Muhyiddin Yassin, who actually called out the violence happening in Myanmar, or my Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dato Sri Hishamuddin Tun Hussein On, who so fearlessly stood up for Palestine and who so fearlessly on the 15th of May 2021 gave what I'd like to say a diplomatic dressing down to the members of OIC to take action against the Israelis' illegal occupations and bombing towards Palestine. Now, how many of these ethical leaders do we have in ASEAN is the question. Those who are willing to choose ethics as opposed to the right political move, as opposed to selfishness. This we need. And then to know, to assess whether the ASEAN future is bright or bleak, is to analyze the next generation, me, myself included, of the ASEAN leaders. So I thought, Dr. Bob, this is a great opportunity for me to call upon my generation and the next to indulge ourselves in self-reflection and to continuously challenge ourselves to do what is genuinely ethical, not just on a state or not just on a national level, but also on a personal level, as simple as speaking the truth or, not lying to your parents. Perhaps some of them can relate. As simple as choosing the industry you wish to enter ethically. Now, I will explain the significance behind this, but on the note of choosing the right industry to enter, I also thought it'd be a great opportunity for me to share with the audience some of my experiences of actually mentoring young entrepreneurs. And I'm not saying everyone is like this, but a lot or the vast majority, when I do ask the question of why did you decide to venture into the social entrepreneurship industry, the industry that I am currently in, the answers, most of them frustrates me a lot. So it's either I decided to enter into the social entrepreneurship because it's the new in thing, or because it's a trend, and then worse, because it brings so much fame. And now, again, I'm not saying it's everybody, but I think it's wise for me to speak about this, because it's wise for us to all ponder upon as to whether entering an industry, regardless if it's social entrepreneurship or the rest, entering an industry because it's a trend and because it brings so much fame, now, is that ethical? Right? And there is a straight answer to that. And the answer is no, it is not ethical. And I believe you, Dr. Bob, and the rest of my esteemed panel would agree with me on this, especially the social entrepreneurship industry, given that you are supposed to devote your life in actually helping others. And you cannot help others if your ethics is questionable. Now, why do I speak about this? And then why do I say that we need to start practicing ethical values in our personal life? And the reason why I give all these examples is because when we talk about ethics, right, as complicated as it gets, it is actually also very simple. And it's actually back to basics, because ethics begin with us. Ethics begin at home. You cannot be an ethical leader if you are not ethical yourself in your personal life? Now, ethical leadership of ASEAN and in ASEAN, Dr. Bob, would be non-existent if we ourselves are not ethical first. Now, there is also, of course, another side of the coin that I wanted to highlight, and that ethical leaders must also have that sense of urgency when being presented with issues related to humanity. And I know humanity is a broad word, but it does encompass everything from lives to livelihood, which, if I can be as forthright and as candid as I can, is lacking in not just ASEAN today, but also the whole world. In fact, I had the opportunity yesterday to witness firsthand how a minister, well, a former minister, now that his position was taken away, blatantly disregarded a major train accident that happened, putting personal reasons above the citizens, although his mandate was to perform otherwise. And take the humanitarian issues happening in Myanmar, as well as in Palestine, for instance. How many days or months does it take for the world leaders and people with power to speak up and to come together to put an end to the violence? Now, one can argue, ladies and gentlemen, that choosing to be silent amidst atrocities and calamities is unethical, in which, in fact, I believe that it is. And that, in fact, I believe if you are neutral or if you choose to be silent in situations of injustice, you have indeed chosen the side of the oppressors. Just echoing what Dr. Marzuki said, I must agree. If the future leaders of ASEAN, if the youths are meek and timid, are not speaking up, then I, as a young leader myself, would say that yes, the future of ASEAN is bleak. So perhaps to those who are listening, who are of my age or younger, in university or in high school, it is important that we ourselves practice ethical leadership in our personal life, because it does begin there. And it's as simple as speaking up against injustices. Our responsibility to ensure a brighter future for ASEAN is to observe our ethics, so we can be a part of a sustainable change, so we can change the narrative of ASEAN and be a part of the ethical leaders of the world ourselves. So I guess, Dr. Bob, I will leave the audiences and myself as well with a question, which I mentioned earlier in the very beginning, is in dire need of an answer, and that is, are we ourselves ethical in the first place? Back to you, Dr. Bob.
Thank you for that. I think this constitutes a real change of pace also with the generation. Certainly the passion is there, and you raise a number of very important questions and show us also, I think, a very good example of how ethics can be translated into action. And so this brings us to our last panelist, last but not least, actually very important because in a sense, Jamesun Bejarin represents the student body, and we have over 1,000 people registered for this webinar, and we know that the majority will be students or people at the student or youth. So JB, I'll call you JB for short. You're a third-year student at Loyola Schools at Ateneo de Manila University in Philippines. You study political science and a Master of Arts in Public Management. You're the president of the school's student government, Sanguinian. You work with different stakeholders in the university community. You've been active during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you have stated that your dream is to be an ethical leader in culture change and instrumental. I hope we've also heard and seen in the press regularly talk about the so-called milk tea movement, and I hope you'll be able to tell us what is going on with the students of ASEAN today. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, and thank you to the previous panelists and speakers. Let me just address everyone. His Excellency Jose Ramos-Horta, Director Gil Gonzalez, Chairperson Marzuki De Rusman, Director Yang Mee Eng, Raudhah Nazran, Dr. Bob, Audrey, and to our audience, virtual audience from different parts of the world. a good day to all of us. From Manila, magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. I consider it a distinct honor and privilege to be part of this panel of ASEAN sectoral leaders to discuss our future as a region in terms of ethical leadership. I believe, like my previous panelists, that this is one of the most consequential issues that shall be the driver of change for the next few years, not only for the region, but for the world. Next slide, please. So I hope to give justice to the experiences of my generation, giving a voice to the experiences that they encounter every day, their hopes, their dreams, and even their disappointments. I aim to do this by first providing a glimpse of what we are going through as members of this sector, then discussing how this affects the dilemmas and ethical considerations that we consider. After which I hope to share how the youth already lead in their own communities and apply these dilemmas, and how they face challenges in youth ethical servant leadership. Next slide, please. So what is the context of the youth today? Well, we are facing a once-in-a-century pandemic. And I guess the youth have always been characterized for their boundless confidence, their vigor, and optimism. The youth have always been characterized as going beyond the status quo and hoping to reimagine the future that they are currently in, that they are born into. However, we have seen how the various shifts in the world we live in our politics and societal dynamics, have led to where our world is now and how our youth are about to respond to this, or are responding to it. Next slide, please. So looking at this example of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is once in a century, and it's not as if any one of us, or most of us, have encountered it before. Its impact transcends the overflowing hospitals that we see in our news screens because it affects all sectors of society, especially the sector of education, business, tourism, in a way that changes how our communities work and how our families live and interact in unprecedented scale and pace. In human terms, people are grieving. People are grieving lives that have been lost. People are grieving lives that could have been. But while the pandemic has indeed caught us off guard, I argue that we are now vulnerable because we have been caught unprepared. And because beneath the lives we miss are actually deep-seated issues that have persisted for the longest time, that have been left unresolved even before us as youth have come into this world. The suffering of our healthcare systems, for example, show how we have not prioritized the well-being of our populations. How a virus like COVID-19 can just disturb our way of living shows how we have not prioritized science and research, and how pathogens should be stopped in order to protect the population. Next slide, please. And so our lives are caught in a halt. For example, our education systems in different parts of the region have been forced to adjust abruptly. Some are implementing online classes, some modular delivery of education, some blended learning, and some countries have the luxury of holding on-site classes. But my point in all of these changes is, while we laud our students and our teachers and our administrators for being able to continue their desire for learning in this sense of uncertainty, we ought to ask ourselves if the kind of education that we are in right now are preparing us for 21st century challenges. This is not to point fingers on anyone, but challenge us to go beyond us trying to be resilient at this time. Next slide, please. Even with this age of technology, we ought to ask ourselves how communication and technology, while they may be good, also have their own flip side. Like any tool, technology is as much a possible force of evil. It has been used both as an instrument for unity and truth, and discord and fake news. Next slide, please. Our young people, like any other generation, are hurting. Not because they cannot transcend the challenges that they face. I believe that the youth are very strong, very talented, very smart if they put their minds into it. But because they are overwhelmed with the demand to do better, the members of this sector cannot help but feel alone and scared. Being in a high pressure environment and facing an uncertain future where a lot of catching up is needed to be done. Next slide, please. And lastly, the issue of climate. When typhoons and other forces of nature, and this is very true for our region, impacts an individual, one cannot help but feel helpless. Helpless, especially when the scale of the needed action to combat this crisis takes more than just one individual, one community, and one nation. When our individual actions are just simply not enough. Next slide, please. So these circumstances and experiences are what are molding our youth's ethics right now and shall continue to shape how the youth go about dilemmas and lead towards the future. Next slide, please. This is a picture from the Guidon, the Ateneo student publication, and it's part of an article called Down from the Hill. With the widening gap between the rich and the poor, how to go about one's privilege or the lack thereof is a growing challenge for this generation. We do not choose which family we are born into, but whether we are born rich or born poor, we are challenged by the system that we are in. For those who are well off, for example, it is the discomforting truth that the system that they are born into benefits them at the expense of others. For those born into poverty, there is a natural barrier. And while they may try to overcome these multiple barriers in front of them, it is often only with sheer will and determination, which is simply not enough. Next slide, please. With the rise of authoritarianism around the world, not only here in the Philippines, but also different parts of the region, the question of whether reform and incremental change is enough. It becomes a dichotomy between reform and revolution, which is very difficult to be caught in between. Particularly when in the process of reform, one is forced to play with power and inevitably and sadly compromise one's values, often at the expense of those outside the game. Next slide, please. And while it has been thought that education provides necessary formation and preparation for the future, the uncertainty that the future brings continues to creep into the minds of those who shall inherit the present. This pressures the young in seeking for ways to act as early as now. I think this is something that previous generations before us have faced. And so this is not simply something that's born into the youth's sense of privilege or the youth's sense of being weak or being timid. Rather, this is a very human motion, human fall. Next slide, please. So the youth can be guided by virtue, in an Aristotelian sense, finding the golden mean. As norms continuously shift, the challenge for a person going through one's formative years is truly to gauge between what is too little and too much. Next slide, please. Next slide. The young can also choose one's actions with the moral worth of one's principles. But as we continue to challenge democratization, the challenge is whether one can truly exercise one's free will in deciding one's duty. Next slide, please. And lastly, while doing good for the greatest number of people is a worthy and admirable principle, the challenge remains on how to deal with those who are left out and marginalized by utility. Next slide, please. So amid these complexities, the youth continue to face challenges head on. And it is my hope that we continue to find our own set of ethics based on the circumstances that we face. So these are just my last few slides. We've grown up in an environment where going beyond oneself is a natural thing to do. The youth of today are very interested in advocacies that go beyond oneself, where growing as a person and growing communities are not mutually exclusive. Next slide, please. The youth also aim to maximize the spaces already made available for them to participate. And the challenge really for the youth is finding their space in the spaces made available and pushing the bounds when possible. Next slide. In a region, and as Bob have mentioned, in a region where authoritarian regimes and tendencies have risen, the youth, with the freshness of their perspectives and courage and boundless energy, continue to question the status quo and reimagine what is possible, regardless of what they're up against. Next slide, please. And lastly, at the core of the youth is just the desire to do good, even amid their imperfections and even amidst their youth, to show compassion and be in solidarity with the marginalized. And I guess that's common across anyone, the desire to just do good. Last few slides. As we face the future, these challenges remain for the youth to maximize ethical leadership and to be prepared to lead the future. Next slide. What are the barriers towards empowering the youth, not only to be formed and to be prepared for the future, but to initiate change and lead in their communities and societies as early as now? Throughout my past years in college, I've had the opportunity to encounter youth from different parts of the world. This is actually in a conference in Singapore where I met people from Malaysia, China, and other parts of the region. And a constant question I ask when going to these conferences are, how could the youth at large be provided with these opportunities, especially when they're one of the most populous populations that we have, and there are a limited set of opportunities made available. Next slide. And how could the youth be provided spaces to lead and engage as early as now? We cannot be simply content with forming and preparing them. We need to give them the spaces to unleash their potential as early as now, to make mistakes as early as now. So when the stakes are higher, they do not end up committing blunders affecting too many people. We cannot afford to waste the potential, energy, and fresh perspectives that the young can provide. In the Ateneo, in our university, the elders trust us as the student council to forward proposals to partake in university decision-making. And I guess that is the challenge, not only for our leaders at the pinnacle of our institutions, but also at the level of our communities and families, especially with the need to collaborate with other generations living in the same space in time. So my last 2 points are, next slide. Ethical leadership is molded amongst the youth through opportunities to learn, participate, and experience dilemmas real hand now. And lastly, we need to channel the energy and ideas of the youth towards greater impact through spaces for proactive youth engagement and shared multi-sectoral decision-making now. Last slide. Salamat.
Thank you. Let me turn on my camera. Yeah. Thank you very much, JB, and thanks to all of the panelists. Now, what we have done is you can start to look at the clock. There are hundreds of you out there, and what we have done in 2.5 hours is probably the equivalent of a 2-day seminar where we would have interaction, etc. But with so many, we can never get to the point of having the dialogue that we would like to have with these panelists, which is why we had so many panelists coming to bring different perspectives on ethical leadership in ASEAN. Nevertheless, we have some time, another 10 minutes, for you to ask questions. And you please ask any questions that you can write those questions to specific members of the panel, because we're going to have very, very short answers because of the time is limited, and then we'll come to the conclusion on time. So at this point, I'd like to hand it back to our Master of Ceremonies, Naparat, and maybe you can help us through the questions that have come in.
Yes. Interestingly, we've received quite a lot of interesting questions from the audience, but unfortunately that we cannot take in all the questions for individual speakers due to the time constraints. So I think we can take in one or two at the most questions.
Yes.
Yes. So please let me ask the question that aim for all the speakers. Just one, please let me start with this question. Will ASEAN collectively demonstrate in its leadership the PANTER ideals of leadership? PANTER stand for participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human rights, empowerment, and rule of law. I will read the question again. Will ASEAN collectively demonstrate in its leadership the PANTER ideals of leadership? Participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human rights, empowerment, and the rule of law.
Tough question. Who do you think we should ask first, Naparat?
Any volunteer?
The question is will. So we got 50 years generational difference between, let's say, Pak Marzuki and JB and Raudhah. So let's start with the youth first, and then we'll go to the youth first, and then wisdom.
May I start?
Will it happen? Because you're the guys that you're the generation that will make it, that will actually be the ones to decide. What do you think is going to happen? What's your answer?
Bob, can you start?
Yeah.
I guess as they say, politics is the art of the possible, and anything is possible. And the acronym that is just spelled out really provides a glimpse of what could be. But I guess the challenge right now is, and this has been stressed throughout the conference, the diversity of the ASEAN is something to transcend. How could we gather consensus to have these as the values to begin with? And who shall decide this? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves, especially me as a member of the youth.
Thank you. Raudhah?
It is indeed a very difficult question to answer, Dr. Bob, if I may say. I mean, I echo everything that JB mentioned, and I think he spoke so eloquently about it. I think in the interest of time, we'll give it to the people of wisdom.
Marzuki, let's go to you, please. Will this happen? And you've seen a historical period, historical phases.
No, yeah, Bob, I think this has been a wonderful moment, getting all these views together. And of course, we don't intend to have the last say on things, because this is a conversation that has to continue. Right. But just to start from the basics, what is the difference between human rights and ethics? That goes to the heart of the issue. Human rights is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Ethics is doing every time trying to do a better way of doing things. It's more a good and bad kind of a choice, whereas morality is a right and wrong choice. Mm-hmm. So it's a difference between a conversation stopper, which is human rights sometimes among people, and a conversation goer, which is ethics, because everyone is involved in that. So just to simplify, as I mentioned, the approach here is twofold. One is to look at the leaders to act ethically, but the flip side is to see to it that ethics take the lead in conducting business in ASEAN, and therefore it comes down to let's be frank. We recognize a leader when we see him or her.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be an academic kind of an exercise, you know. Now, two things, as if I may just one, whether or not we are concerned with others, and I think I take the cue from Raudhah, that being ethical ourselves is to be concerned not of ourselves but for others, and that goes to the heart of social justice. And secondly, the way to do things. There are so many ways of doing things, and Dr. Young was mentioning that we need to be cognizant of the cultural diversity. But one thing that at the end of the day, being ethical is being watchful whether or not you act in a cruel way towards your fellow human beings. That much is enough for myself. Whether or not I act in a good way rather than a cruel way, and that can just guide you in the most difficult time.
Thank you. Or as we say at the ASEAN Human Development Organization in work, the question is whether someone who is coming into a company leaves better than when they came in. Now, I think we have time for one more question.
May I just?
Gil, I was going to come to you.
Okay, very interesting question.
Yes, go ahead.
Very quickly, I don't think there's any leader in his right mind will say, I am not for Panther, that I am not for participation, human rights, accountability. Otherwise, I will conclude that you're a corrupt leader. Okay. Now, while there is always the will and the desire to be an ideal leader, the truth of the matter is we have a flawed, we are a flawed being, meaning to say the will is the will is strong, but the flesh is weak. Okay, and let's not fool ourselves, huh? Corruption can never be fully eradicated. Otherwise, you're talking of another space and time. Right. But we can only lessen the occasions for corruption. So what is the challenge? To have the ecosystem for ethical leadership. From the top, ethical. The regulation, the policy should be there. From the private side, to champion, to advocate, from education, the youth, everybody should work together. So I think that's where the collaboration will really have to happen.
Thank you, Gil, and that's very important that what you're talking about is in the private business sector. So I'll leave the final answer to Dr. Young. You're the one that has the responsibility within ASEAN of developing ethical leaders. You're not the only one. Obviously, the ASEAN Youth or the ASEAN University Network has a very big responsibility as well. But the ASEAN Foundation is really created for this. So what do you think? The answer is, will this happen?
I'm not final say again. We don't want to have a final say, okay? I agree with what Gil has mentioned. It's not that easy. It's not black and white. Sometimes there's a gray area, Ethical in what way? Because sometimes when you make some decision, some other parties might find it unethical, but another party might find it, it's ethical. It's the best way. Actually, I just say that it's the best decision you can make during that situation.
Yes, the dialogue.
So that is what I'm trying to say. Ethical in what sense? But of course, we will never condone to unethical act, which is corruption. Again, we want to stress corruption is killing everything that we are doing, the good things. I mean, everybody has spelled out the examples of corruptions and self-interest and all that. So I think that's all I want to say. There's always a gray area. It depends on where you are standing, whether it's ethical or not, but the basic principle is the same for everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Looking at the time, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for the questions, but we will record those questions and we'll keep them in the report. because they're quite important, and we want to address those at a later stage. So to give you, as the moderator, just to sort of wrap this up, and then I'll hand it back to Naparat as our Master of Ceremonies. But we've seen today in the question of ethical leadership, we started out with a special kind of leadership, which is possibly the most visible, which is the Nobel Prize for Peace is awarded to people who are not only ethical, but who have done extraordinary or remarkable things in ethics. And we have two of those in ASEAN. And so we've had the privilege of listening to one and a very strong and outspoken, I would say, views on what is important for ethics in ASEAN, and particularly in the present context. We've also seen that ASEAN is in a spotlight, and I think we've all agreed that this spotlight is creating a sort of crisis point on the question of Myanmar, not because there's one country that is in danger, that's itself very important, but the larger ethical question is, what do the other countries and what does the community do about it? So we're in a stage in which ethics has become really very important and very visible, not only in ASEAN, but to the world. At the same time, however, we've seen with our other speakers that ASEAN is moving forward. We've seen quite a number of areas, certainly in what we could call prosperity. I mean, a lot of the indicators for human development as well as economics are very positive. We're in a very exciting part of the world with high growth. Despite the COVID pandemic, we're moving, but we are also moving, this was, I think, very important to underline, to a new phase in the ASEAN community where ethics is becoming central for leaders of all kinds. We see that in business, we see it in youth, and this generation and the awareness, and I thank our younger speakers to question this. The next generation, is it going to be more ethical? Well, they're aware of the ethics, but are they really going to do it is under question. So we see that we need to have a voice, we need to have solidarity. We're seeing a phase in which national concerns and national awareness is giving way more to a regional awareness, not just the ASEAN countries, but to the region itself, the larger region, what's going on, as well as to the world itself. So this is where we are in this ethical situation, and it makes me personally thankful for this webinar, because it highlights the sort of intuitions that we had when the founders were starting to say that we needed to have some kind of forum where we could begin to discuss ethical issues. And there will be others in the future, in future webinars with the ICAR system. Now I'd like to hand this over to Naparat to close off the webinar.
Thank you, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar on ethical leadership of ASEAN and in ASEAN has been an extremely informative webinar. The AUN Secretariat and the co-organizers would like to express our sincerest gratitude to His Excellency Shoulder Ramos-Horta and all the speakers for sharing their views on this topic and making this webinar a meaningful one. Our gratitude also goes to Dr. Bob Audrey for being an incredible conductor. Our sincere appreciation also goes to our wonderful audience on YouTube for their active participation. Before we end this webinar, I would like to request the audience to spend a few minutes to fill in the survey. You can scan the QR code that shows on the screen now, or go to the link in the comment box on YouTube Live. For those who request a certificate, you can ask for it by completing the survey form. Please be reminded to provide your full name and your correct email address. Since this webinar is recorded, please feel free to check it out on the AUN YouTube channel. We have another webinar coming up soon, so stay tuned for that, as it will be on another great topic. Well, once again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. We wish you have a great day and see you again next time. Thank you.